In Chapter 13, we're going to be talking about groups for adult clients. So adulthood, for many of you, adult clients are who you're going to primarily be working with, especially in the mental health side of things. Although in schools you may still have groups for adults. You've seen psychoeducational or community development groups in the evenings, or groups for parents around helping students be successful or coping with parenting related issues or stress. And so many of you, even though you are not primarily focused on working with adults, may still interact with adults in a group context. And so adulthood, from what we know in human development, implies that a person has reached some amount of emotional maturity, although we know that this maturing process and identity development process does evolve across the lifespan. It doesn't necessarily end at any point in adulthood, as we'll learn in the next chapter as we're talking about late adulthood. And so we have to think about adulthood as this multi-dimensional stage of growth. And so venturing out on one's own in emerging adulthood, taking on all of these different new roles and navigating all these different transitions in the majority of adulthood, and then coming to the point of transitioning into being an older adult. And so think about all of the different unpredictability, all of the changes, all of the different developmental issues, all of the different roles that you take on in the trajectory of the time that you leave the nest, become an emerging adult, and then work to the point where you're transitioning into an older adult space in your life. A lot of things come up, and things that can be helped and navigated in a group context, because it's useful to connect with others who are going through some of the same sorts of transitions or struggles that you are. So in terms of adulthood, developmental literature tells us that we can conceptualize adulthood generally for individuals between the ages of 20 and about 60 to 65 when you're transitioning into being an older adult. And we know that adulthood kind of happens in different sorts of stages. It would be really unfair to lump a 20-year-old in with someone who's in their 40s, because they're just in very different developmental places, which we know from looking at theorists like Erikson. So we are seeing some different stages of adulthood being established in terms of development literature. And one that's really a newer idea but becoming much more established is this idea of emerging adulthood. And so it's this idea that individuals are transitioning from adolescence into adulthood. And so in this, we look at individuals from about 18 until somewhere in their mid-20s. And this is a time when individuals might be moving out for the first time, they might be attending college, they might be starting serious relationships, or just kind of establishing their own independent identities. But what we're seeing is a lot of times these individuals are still maybe needing some supports and some additional help and guidance from their primary family members or their parents or their caregivers or whomever that person was in their childhood and adolescence. And so we're seeing, especially more recently, people starting out on their own a little later than they had maybe 20 years ago. And so this idea of emerging adulthood encompasses this group of individuals that are not quite adolescents because they have a little more independence in their lives, but are not really full-fledged adults yet because they're still needing those supports and the guidance of others to be able to establish that identity on their own. Then we have young adulthood, which emerging adulthood theory says starts maybe around 25, 27 and goes up to about 40. Some literature puts all of these individuals together in young adulthood, starting at about 18 or 20 years old. But this emerging adulthood literature kind of counters that argument and saying that you can't really put them together necessarily, because someone who's just moving out on their own for the first time versus someone who's maybe in their mid-30s are not in the same kind of developmental space and might have different needs in terms of supports. And so young adults, in addition to these emerging adults, have kind of the same sort of Erikson stages of struggle around identity establishment and development, Some of that might carry forward from adolescence if those things weren't quite resolved. And then this idea of intimacy and establishing relationships and thinking about this is when we see people find spouses or become parents, take on different kinds of roles that include new relationships with new aspects of intimacy that they may not have encountered yet. And then midlife, so looking at late 30s to 40 maybe until you are transitioning into older adulthood in your 60s, which is when individuals are usually working full time, have established some of those identities and relationships. And so now they're looking at life goals, they're looking at contributing to society as a whole. These debates about the best ways to spend your time and what you value and how to really kind of measure your life and the success of your life. And we know that these things are often not linear, and they don't necessarily happen in these very specific developmental stages or at certain ages of your life. Everyone's different. That's part of why groups in adulthood become useful, because if someone, for example, loses their job and needs to make a transition to a new career in their 40s, that would be something that they might need some help and support around. And so we know that some of these things happen typically in these developmental stages, but we also know that nobody really works on this linear system of things happening or checklists that you work your way down throughout your life, and that things come up and happen that disrupt those processes or make them more complicated, just in the way also that you might see early life traumas or different things that have happened in childhood and adolescence popping back up at different developmental stages and potentially negatively impacting your clients to the point where they might need some support or validation from others who are having similar experiences. So looking at groups for adults, we have work and task groups all the time. They're rarely specifically labeled as groups, but think about how often in work or in the community, in volunteering, in different ways that you're involved with different aspects of your community that you would see a group context evolve or be created around some kind of task. And sometimes the leader is quite clear in these groups and sometimes it's not. And so just be aware that those things come up all the time and not necessarily in a counseling context. I'm sure all of you as clinicians will be a part of things like treatment teams, and these are group contexts as well. Counseling groups for adults can be really centered on all of these different ideas of adulthood and different things that happen throughout the lifespan that we've talked about. Specifically, we see a lot of groups coming around transitions in career, transitions in identity and roles, transitions in becoming parents, transitions in marriage or divorce. So in these kind of big life events, we see a lot of transitions that mark changes in the lifespan and the life cycle that individuals might find some comfort in a group context of validation of others in those experiences. And then psychotherapy. And so psychotherapy groups for adults might look like examining more severe diagnoses or helping with deep-seated trauma or using certain theoretical models that just include more in-depth and long-term treatment. And so you might see these in inpatient facilities where you're managing severe mental illness or maybe addressing suicide, or on an outpatient basis where you're helping with aftercare or transitions after an inpatient experience, or just helping an individual navigate severe mental illness or perhaps a developmental disability throughout the lifespan. And so for adults, when you're setting up groups, a lot of this is similar to any other kind of group. Just thinking about your adult audience as opposed to children or adolescents might ask a few more questions or might need a little more structure or a little more transparency in why you're doing certain things, whereas children and adolescents might be more on board with trying new things without knowing what your ultimate purpose is at the beginning. You, with adults, probably need to be very clear about the purpose of the group and why everyone is there. Also because sometimes with adolescents this is the case, but certainly with adults, usually they are responsible for the decision to come to group themselves. And so they might be referred, but ultimately, unless it's a mandated group for probation or something, they're the ones deciding if it's worth their time to come every week to drive themselves to wherever it is that you're having the group and to participate. And so you have to really get buy-in from your clients and your participants so that they understand why the group is important. And so it's important to have a clear purpose for the group. It's important, very important, especially with psychotherapy groups, to screen potential group members to make sure they're going to be appropriate and safe. And with adults, again, in the case of mandated groups, maybe not as much, but usually with adults, you do have some options in terms of screening because you can refer them to other resources if they're not appropriate for a group or might potentially represent harm for people in a group if they're a participant or a member. The rules are very important, especially rules around things like confidentiality and people understanding the limits of confidentiality, because that legal and ethical obligation is there. They're over 18. And so we really have to make sure that they understand and go through informed consent and really know that that confidentiality can't be guaranteed, that subgroups are going to become likely and they might be tempted to connect with each other outside of group, and that that won't be allowed as a group member. So rights and expectations and group norms and informed consent should be very clear and should be gone through with everyone together and separately through that screening process so that everyone is very much aware of what the group process is going to entail and what their rights are and how they're going to be kept safe as members of the group. It's also important with adults to be clear about the qualifications of the leader of the group. And not everyone as a group leader is a licensed professional counselor. We know this and talked about this. And so it's really important that they understand the certifications and qualifications of group leaders and what qualifies them to be group leaders, and then what to expect in terms of the scope of practice for those individuals. So for all of you, it might be important to establish that we don't talk about medication in group because that's something that's beyond your scope of practice. So when you're acting as a group facilitator and leader for adults, you of course are going to want to approach different types of groups differently. So something that's a task or psychoeducation group might look very different than something that's a counseling or a psychotherapy group. And counseling and psychotherapy groups are going to look very different in terms of their duration and their focus and the way that you are facilitating them. Screening individuals as appropriate members is going to look slightly different depending on the type of group, the subject of the group, the format of the group, thinking about open-ended or closed-ended. So those kinds of things are just as relevant and important with adults. It just might look a little different because all of your group members, for the most part, are probably going to be attending of their own fruition. They're going to be transporting themselves using public transportation or their own transportation or whatever the case. They're just not dependent on others. And so you don't necessarily have to keep a parent or a guardian in the loop about those kinds of things. You're dealing directly with the group members for the most part. And then in psychoeducational groups, with adults, you want to plan very carefully and intentionally, especially when using activities. As we've talked about, it's really important to have a clear focus and intention behind using them and a rationale behind everything that you're doing in the group, because they'll ask you why they have to do certain things. And so it's very important for you to think through and to know why they're doing certain things and how it's helpful for the purpose of the group and why you're using those particular activities. And so you want to be really clear from the beginning of the group in psychoeducation what kinds of skills the individuals are going to be learning and developing, and making sure that everything that happens in the group sessions are very clearly aligned with those outcomes and those skills and those goals for the group. Further, counseling and psychotherapy, you want to make sure that you're using some kind of theoretical model to drive you. We'll examine these in the last 2 chapters of your textbook, but you want to make sure that you're doing everything within your scope of practice and in accordance to your code of ethics and driven by some sort of theory or model of development or of change. Task and work groups, really the leader's going to focus on the outcome and the goal of the group, and so a lot of these groups are not necessarily going to be led by counselors, but there's something that might happen all the time in other contexts. So some examples of groups that you might use with adults, looking at emerging adulthood group. College students groups are really great because individuals can find validation and support from their peers. You kind of get the most bang for your buck in terms of time commitment because college students are busy and they don't always have a lot of time to dedicate to their own needs and their own self-care, or they aren't as likely or willing to engage in those self-care activities. And so if you can have a group once a week or every other week or once a month or whatever the case that's just there as a support when individuals need it, that's a really useful thing. And so these are just some examples, and I'm sure you could develop and think of other possibilities, but thinking about pressure to perform. In college, depression and anxiety are really common with individuals when they're moving out on their own for the first time. Health, anything around physical health, so weight or exercise or just kind of learning how to manage your own basic wellness for the first time potentially since you've moved away from home. Relationship issues become huge, especially around sexuality. Career, so especially if you're working in a career center at a college, thinking about career awareness or exploration, or you can have groups about how to land an appropriate job, like we had the example of in class. And then looking at the more counseling-oriented types of groups, you have, of course, anything trauma-based. You might have anything related to substance use, abuse survivors and trauma around those kind of incidents, especially if they're in childhood, because those things can come up again when you're out on your own and maybe starting to engage in some sexual practices or connecting with partners in a new way as an adult. Homesickness and grief, of course, are really relevant things that might require a little more counseling support. And then we see a lot around sexuality, how to connect with others, sexual orientation, gender identity. Individuals in college have this space to kind of start to figure out who they are in these pieces of identity, as we know from the Erikson model. And so with that comes some need, especially in areas where you don't see as much representation of your different kinds of identities in your community. Having a group with either supportive individuals or like-minded individuals or others who are going through this questioning stage of their life is really useful, because then it's easy to get into a place where you feel like you're the only one struggling with these kinds of issues, and having that group context helps you understand that you're not. Other people are struggling with these sexuality or identity issues as well. Looking at some older adults in that midlife developmental stage, thinking about some tools that can be useful. Don't limit yourself to using activities only with adolescents and emerging adults. Adults enjoy activities too. You just have to be sure that you're intentional in the way that you set them up and you're clear about the purpose of the activity. But adults love activities. You'd be surprised. Grief, especially working into more older adults, you're going to start to see more grief experiences and loss experiences, so having groups around that is really useful. Again, substance use touches everyone in some kind of way, so support groups around substance use, around abuse of others that you love, but also abuse of yourself. And we see, even if that trauma and abuse occurred in childhood, it comes up again and again throughout the lifespan. So having that support is really critical. Suicide survivors or loved ones of those who have completed suicide, any kind of trauma, career change and supports are really big with this age group, because we're seeing more and more with the way the economy's been going and the way the job market has been changing. People are just changing careers and jobs much more frequently than they used to. And so because we know from career class, so much of your identity is wrapped up in who you are and what you do, having any kind of disruption in a career trajectory or in your career goals, or having to make those kinds of changes, especially in adulthood, is really challenging. And so having some supports, both in a psychoeducational stance of how to seek out new career, but also from a place of support in that you're not the only one coping with this change and that it's hard is useful. So with any other portion of the lifespan, you want to think about heterogeneous versus homogeneous groups. And so is it useful to have a mixed gender group versus is it useful to have a group that's just men or just women or just gender nonconforming clients or trans clients? So thinking about the topic and the purpose of your group, and then if having a gender specific group gives someone more of a safe space to explore those particular topics and what would be appropriate. So survivors of domestic violence groups, we don't think about often men needing those supports as women need those supports. And so I know in particular around survivors of domestic violence, we see a lot of women specific groups, but men don't necessarily have a space to go and feel safe. However, if someone is a survivor of domestic abuse and the male is the perpetrator, having a man in the group might not be useful for them. So there's one of those things where there's no clear answer, but you have to make the right choices for the client population you're trying to serve and reach. And then you also have to make sure that you're providing appropriate referrals or maybe recognizing an opportunity to introduce a new type of group to a community that's not being served. Other examples of adult groups, we see a lot of relationship transitions happening in adulthood. So seeing people getting married or entering into domestic partnerships or spousal partnerships, establishing families, becoming parents, loss of children, loss of parenting identity, changes in parenting identity as children go through the lifespan themselves. We see divorce and separation and widows and widowers. Going through remarriage and navigating parenting through all of those processes. So we see a lot of different kinds of transitions around relationships that are useful to address in a group context. And there are some examples here for you, and I'm sure you can think of some other examples that are not represented as well. But we see a lot of relationship-focused needs in counseling in general for adults, but also specifically in groups. And again, that's where it's important to think about the different types of individuals that would be appropriate for a group and thinking if gender specific versus a mixed genders group would make sense or be useful. We also see individuals who have had interactions with the justice system. So looking at mandated groups or groups for offenders or transition groups out of the prison system and back into the general community. So we see with adults specifically a lot of groups around probation mandated anger management or substance use or those transitions out of the prison system. And group context seems to be a really nice space to provide those services to those clients who need them.